So today we're in Nagoya, Japan, and this is the Jolt Call conference, and I'm joined by Professor Regine Hampel, and she comes from the Open University in the UK. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for the invitation.
And we enjoyed your keynote speech yesterday, and I want to talk about some of the issues you raised in the speech. But first of all, a British audience will know the Open University well, but for international audience, can you explain a little bit about the organisation?
Okay, yes, the Open University, I think, is one of the first distance education institutions in the world. It was founded in the late 1960s to provide education to people who, once they'd finished school, didn't have the chance to attend a university. So we used to have lots of people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s and even older who came to study with us.
And how did you come to the Open University? Can you tell us a little bit about your history?
Okay, so yes, I worked for various universities teaching German in the UK and actually started as an associate lecturer at the Open University back in 1999, and I taught German for a year. Really enjoyed it, and then a post came up, a lectureship. I applied for it, got it in 2000, and I've been at the Open University since.
Okay. You mentioned yesterday that actually the Open University, although it has quite a long history, it didn't actually have any language courses until relatively recently.
That's correct. I think people just felt that it was really difficult to teach languages at a distance, or almost impossible actually. So I think it took us a long time to come to the decision that yes, you can teach it at a distance, and at that point when we started, which was in the very late 90s, there was a little bit more available in terms of technology. So the first language courses were actually a mix of books on the one hand, but then also quite a lot of audio and video material. So students used to get sent a big box of materials full of books and videos and brochures and a dictionary and things like that. But of course, since then things have moved on quite drastically.
Yeah, well, it would have been, I guess there were phone calls as well in the past, right? Sometimes,
yes, we had telephone tutorials, but we also, even though we're a distance institution, we used to do and still do face-to-face tutorials.
Okay.
So that's for us quite important, and it's important for the students who I think value the face-to-face contact with their local regional-based tutors.
So in some regards it's a blended learning rather than entirely distance learning.
Yes, that's correct. And I mean blended anyway, because you have a mix of materials, you have people involved. Now you have computers and all sorts of resources on the computers, and of course also the possibility to interact with each other via the computer.
Without wishing to be too negative, you mentioned some of the challenges for distance learning, things like student retention, the loneliness of the long distance learner you mentioned, to quote one of your colleagues, I think. Can you outline a few of those problems and explain how you managed to overcome them, or try to overcome them the way you...
Well, I mean, it's quite a lonely existence, sitting at home with your box of stuff and then trying to work through the materials. And I think for that reason we do try and actually structure the materials extremely well. We don't buy textbooks off the shelf, but we actually produce our own materials, and that's not just the case for the course books, but it's also the case for the AV, the audiovisual materials. So when I chaired a new course a few years ago, we actually, with a production team, went both to Germany and to Switzerland and did our own recordings. So we had arranged to meet people. We even just talked to people on the streets and did recordings with them, both audio and video. And then that was edited back home and turned into a whole range of audiovisual resources. So that's one way of dealing with it. And of course, these days it is much easier with all the information and communication technology. So we actually decided really early in the mid-90s to is that right, in the mid-90s? No, in the late 1990s, to build an audio conferencing software. So the Open University produced something, colleagues of ours in the Knowledge Media Institute within the OU produced something called Lyceum, which was audio conferencing, but also supported by other bits and pieces. So text chat, at some point they introduced emoticons, and that was actually then used, first it was piloted, and then it was mainstreamed for use with the students within tutorial groups. So students would meet with their tutor and have a 60-minute session.
So I suppose you create your own materials, but also, generally speaking, you wouldn't take software off the shelf either. You would tend to create purpose-built software where possible.
We used to, but I think it's quite a time-consuming and I don't know whether it's necessarily more expensive process, but I think the Open University has decided more recently to actually go outside. So even though, yes, we had Lyceum, but Lyceum at one point became incompatible with some of the new systems, IT systems that were out there, and so rather than updating it, the decision was taken to actually go outside, and we put out a tender and then started using Illuminate when it was still called Illuminate, and introduced that to students, which is much more sophisticated than Lyceum, but I think probably also posed some additional challenges to students because it is so sophisticated, because it's all sort of all singing, all dancing in a way.
I suppose from a practical point of view, you can't always be sure of the hardware that the students are going to be using at their end, so you need to keep things fairly light, I would imagine, if possible.
Yes, and I think that was a problem with Lyceum at the beginning. I think now that students have just more advanced machines, computers, I think it has become less of a problem. I think people are also more familiar with new technologies than they were 10 or 15 years ago. But at the beginning we did have to run dedicated, or we introduced at some point dedicated learner training to just ensure that students were sort of familiar with the system. And I mean, we have got a huge range of students. We've got students who are sort of in their late teens, up to people in their 70s, 80s. I think the oldest student whom we had was well over 90 in languages. And for some of those, it's a big challenge.
I'm sure. Making a connection between the teacher and the student is one thing, but how do you go about building a peer community, a kind of classroom, virtual classroom community?
Yes, yeah, I think that's really important actually in a distance context to sort of counteract this anonymity that people will feel, and also to get them to interact with each other and actually use the language, because I mean that's what it's all about in language learning. You don't just work with a book, but you do have to talk to people. So we place students into tutor groups. So students tend to have a tutor who is locally based. Each tutor has a group of up to 25 students, and then these groups meet in various ways. So these days there tend to be 2 or 3 face-to-face tutorials over a 9-month period of a course. But then there's also quite a lot of online work. So we use Moodle at the Open University and have done so for a number of years. And each course has a workspace, a website for the module that students use. There are asynchronous activities that they do using a forum. There's a sort of a social forum that students use just for interaction amongst themselves. And then we do have these synchronous tutorials using what is now Blackboard Collaborate.
Okay, it's a challenge, but it sounds like it's possible, right? So let's move on to your keynote from yesterday. And you started and ended the keynote with a couple of quotes which had a similar kind of flavour. The first one from Hubbard was, "The question is no longer whether to use computers, but how," was the gist. so of course in your context technology is a great boon and very, very helpful, but for generally face-to-face situations, I'm working in the university here, for example, do you still think that's the case?
Yes, very much so, especially in the context of language education, where you don't just want to meet with your peers and talk to them in English, in your case presumably, but you also want to try and actually communicate with people who have the language that you are learning as their first language. And so I think, for example, the telecollaborative projects that people have started doing, I think are a great addition to the more conventional ways of language learning. So linking groups of students in one country up with groups of students in another country who are learning each other's language, and then try to connect them and get them to communicate, and at the same time not just learn each other's language and improve speaking each other's language, but also find out about the culture.
Yeah, the telecollaborative projects are quite popular across Europe, I think.
Yes, yes.
I suppose one of the things about Europe is the common framework for languages, which means it's, I would guess, easier to place people with language learners of similar ability level. Do you know if telecollaboration is becoming more popular outside Europe now?
Well, I went to a talk yesterday and the presenter was talking about a project that he was doing in Japan, but he was really keen to actually link up his students with students in other Southeast Asian countries. So he was keen to create links with Taiwan, with Korea. So I think it's probably taking off here as well, and I think people are keen to do that.
Well, that's one thing that technology can certainly allow us to do, is to connect with other speakers, native and non-native speakers of the language we're trying to learn.
Yes,
and it's very motivational for students, I think.
Yes.
Okay, well, as I said, it's kind of state-of-the-art, and you mentioned the EDUCAUSE reports, which are annual reports, about 100,000 students in higher education, mainly in the States, but also other countries. And they're very enlightening as to the trends of what students are thinking.
Yes.
These young people that we often deal with, right?
Yes.
And some of the key points were the bring your own device is becoming very popular. Certainly here in Japan, I've noticed over the last 2 or 3 years that smartphone use has gone from 0 to nearly 100%, I would say, very close to that. Students like to use selective channels, so they use different technologies to communicate with different people in different ways at different times. And there's also some concern from students about the mixture of their academic and their personal spaces. That part I was quite interested in. Could you enlarge on that idea a little bit?
Yes, and actually that allows me to refer to another presentation that I went to yesterday, where we were talking about social networking and what the issues are for us as teachers to use social networking sites for education purposes. Is that something that we want to do? What are the ethics around it? What do we have to consider? Do we want students who are just starting to learn English to actually use English on their Facebook page and thereby sort of exposing that they're making errors, that their English isn't totally correct, which of course is natural for a beginner learner. So there are quite a lot of issues around that, and I think we need to really think about that before we embark on a project such as that. And I think there needs to be more research done in that area as well, because it is all just so new. And I think we also need to consult students what they want and whether they want us to sort of get into their private networks, which might be a problem as well.
Well, the other thing which is connected to that is sometimes teachers can feel a loss of control, especially with mobile learning applications. And we talked a little earlier before the interview about how that could be a positive or a negative thing, depending on your perspective.
Yes.
So what do you think about that, losing
Yes.
control?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think back to the old way of teaching, well, any subject really, or most subjects, but particularly languages, it used to take place in a classroom. So the teacher was at the front, was very much in charge, and the class sort of sat in the benches, listening, interacting, communicating, whatever. So the teacher was very much in control, but these days, when we were just talking about telecollaborative projects, so when you get students to link up with other students in other countries, the teacher very often isn't present, but it's the students who are communicating in a one-to-one setting or in a sort of one group with another group setting. And the same with mobile devices, or mobile settings, where we send the learner out into the world, get them to interact with their surroundings possibly, access materials remotely, but also communicate with people remotely, and there's no teacher present to be sort of in control. And the question is, yes, is that, what are the implications of this? Does a teacher need to be in control? To what extent does he or she have to be in control? And also how you support students then, because of course when you're not there with the student, it's quite difficult to know what the problems are that the student can encounter, and how do you actually plan for these situations?
Well, one issue we have here in Japan, I think, is that our first year university students are still officially minors. Actually, they reach the age of majority at 20.
Okay,
So
yes.
that is something we have to be mindful of, is that we don't want to send them out, and if they get in any trouble out there, then we would be responsible for that, and that's something we certainly want to avoid. But I do feel sometimes that we use technology to manage students and to administrate classes, but then that somehow detracts from the possibilities of creativity. How do you balance that, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, but I think the word balance is probably important here, because you don't want to be too restrictive in what you allow students to do. I think you do need to let them out and get on with the business of language learning and interacting with others. I think task design can help to some extent, that the teacher actually thinks about what he or she wants the students to do and provide a kind of setting through the task that then allows the students to do certain things, but also sort of limits them in a positive way and supports them through that.
Task design is another interesting topic. You mentioned a book edited by Michael Thomas and Hayo Renders, who I've also interviewed a while ago.
Yes.
And I asked you earlier about if you feel CALL itself is becoming a methodology, or if it's maybe facilitating other methodologies, for example, task-based learning. So what's your answer for that?
Yeah, that's it's a really difficult question, actually. And I mean, in a way, if we say that task-based language learning is a methodology, then probably we also should say that CALL is a methodology, although it's a very wide one, because you can do so many things with it. You can do human-to-computer interaction, which is something very different to CMC, computer-mediated communication, where you actually have humans interacting with each other. So I don't know whether we necessarily need the label. I think we just need to be conscious of all the different facets that CALL have on the one hand, and I think all the links that we can create with other sort of pedagogies, methodologies, whatever you want to call them. So, for example, task-based language learning and teaching, and Michael Thomas and Hayo Renders create quite a nice link between the two areas.
So that, I guess that can bring us to the other main part of focus of your keynote yesterday was research and ongoing research and future research. So you talked about some of the kind of trends in research at the moment, and there's still quite a lot of interaction between, we could say, traditional SLA, psycholinguistic ideas, and CALL. But what did you suggest would be, or being under research at the moment? What are things you think we ought to be looking at more?
Well, I think the really interesting area is looking at the kind of difference that using computers in a learning context actually makes, because it is different learning a language via a computer or with the help of a computer, through mobile learning or telecollaborative setups, things like that, and doing it face to face. So that's where my interest lies, and I think that has sparked all sorts of projects where I'm looking at, for example, task design. So how do you actually need to design a task that it works in a computer-mediated environment? What are the implications for students when they're interacting through a computer rather than face-to-face? So I think those are all things that haven't been researched terribly well. I think we've had a lot of research in SLA, but I think if we then put the extra layer of the computer on, I think that creates quite a lot of new opportunities for research.
This is the learner context interface that you talked about.
Yes.
How
yes.
the learner and the environment, whether virtual or real, interact with one another.
Yes, yes. And I mean, I was talking yesterday about sociocultural theory and the importance not just to concentrate on the individual learning a language and the kind of sort of linguistic progress he or she makes, but it's important to actually see the learner in a much bigger context, and that context includes quite a lot of things. It includes the technology, it includes the other learners, it includes the language that they're speaking. I would have thought both the L1 and the L2. It includes tools, tasks, all those things that actually mediate learning, and we have to take them into account when we actually want to find out how best to teach languages and how best to help students to learn a language.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Darren.
Okay, thank you.